Welcome to the Political Risk Podcast, an independent podcast focused on geopolitical risk to serve decision makers in specialty insurance markets, reinsurance, and beyond. I'm your host, David Benyon, and for episode 14, I'm joined by Sir Stewart Eldon, a former UK diplomat and an advisor and commentator on international defence and security issues. Sir Stewart's diplomatic postings include having served as the UK's permanent representative to NATO, UK ambassador to Ireland, and also as the UK's deputy permanent representative to the UN in New York. I'm grateful that we were introduced to each other via his work for the Ambassador Partnership, a specialist partnership of former senior diplomats and ambassadors, with unrivaled networks of influence in almost 100 countries, focused on discreetly helping clients with dispute resolution and political risk expertise. At the end of February, Stewart authored an article titled Global Strategic Change, Adjusting to New Realities, released as part of the Ambassador Partnership's AP and Insight series, available on their website. In response to the tumultuous political risk arena of 2024, the article asks, what's been happening, and what should we expect, and what should we do? There's an awful lot in there to unpick, so this conversation focuses on a few key areas in particular. Firstly, Ukrainian political development and anti-corruption efforts. Then the Middle East, specifically the economic activities of governments in Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Next, we discuss NATO, particularly Turkey and the Security Alliance's new members, Finland and Sweden. Lastly, we turn to Sub-Saharan Africa and the Global South. Well, with all that to cover, we must press on, and I very much hope you enjoy this Around the World in 30 Minutes conversation. Well, Stewart, firstly, thanks for joining me today.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here.
Please would you start us off with an introduction to your thinking in the recent AP Insights article?
Yeah, well, I think we've been conscious for some time of the growing complexity of geostrategic challenges that are facing us all, actually, throughout the world. And I'm afraid it's an increasingly depressing picture. Conflict is springing up all over the place. You've got Ukraine, Gaza, and huge unrest in Africa. Coupled with that, you've got the shocks of economic change, the consequences of COVID, and the consequences of the economic shocks that have resulted from that, and from more recently in shipping routes in the Middle East following what's happening in Gaza. And one consequence of that, I think, is that the Global South is gradually becoming more assertive. And that's symptomatic, I think, of an increasing lack of confidence in existing institutions. And that in turn is linked to a lack of leadership, or a perceived lack of leadership on the part of the West in particular. And it's also linked, I think, to a lack of capacity globally to fully understand and really deal with the multiple shocks we're suffering. And one of the results of that is that the Global South, the BRICS of this world and others, are becoming more assertive. That dissatisfaction is feeding back into a feeling that somehow somebody's got to do something alternative to try and get a grip of the issues that we're facing. And it's all particularly accentuated in 2024 by the fact that we're going to face an unprecedented number of elections around the world. So the challenges to democracy this year are going to be many and varied. And are we equipped globally and nationally, individually, to cope with that? And then finally, perhaps, I think the stresses of domestic issues and domestic political controversies, as currently seen by the extreme sensitivity of the reactions to Gaza in the UK, are pulling attention away from the really broad geostrategic problems that we're all having to cope with. And that in turn means that less attention than perhaps should be is being devoted to them. So it's a really complex picture. The issue, I think, particularly for business, is do you really understand what's going on? Do you understand what your interests are and how you can meet them? And how could you contribute to a better understanding and a better reaction to some of all these difficult problems?
Let's start with Ukraine, because, well, frankly, when isn't it topical? But there's recently been a major political change with Zelensky making a whole slew of senior appointments politically and militarily, including replacing his commander-in-chief, Valery Zaluzhny, who has very popular, I think it's fair to say, with another commander, Alexander Suski. And I may have got that pronunciation wrong, but that's been seen as a political move. So who is the new man, and does this reshuffle carry some major political risks for the Zelensky government?
Well, perhaps you should step back, I think, Dave, initially. I mean, the thing that's become clear in respect of Ukraine over the last few months is that we're now going to be in for a long war. And there are all sorts of reasons for that. They're well known. I won't rehearse them all here, but a lot of it boils down to Ukrainian capability, Ukrainian capacity, weapons, economic support, and so on. And I don't need to go into all that here, although we can certainly explore them if you'd like to. So, as opposed to last autumn, when I began to think about these issues, the course of things in Ukraine have firmed up, and I have to say, not for the better. Now, in those circumstances, you're always going to get tensions between military commanders and political leaders. And another very important factor is that sometimes, as a military campaign proceeds, you do perhaps need a change of military leadership. And as far as I can tell from the position of an outside observer, I mean, there have been growing differences, not necessarily personal, but perhaps of military strategy and tactics between President Zelensky, the Ukrainian political leadership, and the former commander-in-chief. Now, I wouldn't overestimate the effect of the kind of popular political dynamics being discussed here. But the fact of the matter is that both old and new commanders are good soldiers. General Syrskyi, I mean, he is Russian trained. It's very clear that he is completely determined to defend Ukraine. But he may differ from his predecessor about exactly how you go about that. And there are some difficult political and military decisions to weigh in the balance here. I mean, looking at the news reports, it's very clear that one aspect is, do you call up more Ukrainian national servicemen? Do you expand the pool, or do you not, and do you adopt alternative tactics to try and at least hold the line until you've got fast aircraft, more weapons, more ammunition in place? So I think all of these things have to be put into the melting pot. I'm not surprised that things have turned out as the way they have. I think one should look positively in terms of having a fresh pair of eyes at the top of the military structure. And I don't think we can say at this point that one strategy is necessarily better or worse than the other. But President Zelensky's made his choice, and I think we should really be supportive of him in doing that.
So my follow-up question to that is really to repeat a criticism I often hear leveled at Ukraine by, for example, American Republican politicians, but really anyone who's opposed to financing the Ukrainian war effort in the West. And that's the country is very corrupt. Historically, it has been, as are many of its neighbours in that part of the world. So corruption levels, well, they're also related to its ambitions to join the EU as well. But is there evidence for any change to that, any improvement or otherwise?
Well, it's an interesting fact. I mean, I have been involved, or was involved for some years, in providing advice to the international NGO Transparency International on countering corruption and in defence and security. And it's interesting that among the very early takers for that advice was Ukraine. And for some time, under previous Ukrainian governments, TI had quite a large strand of activity going on in Ukraine to support introducing best practice in counter-corruption, particularly in the defence and security sectors. And I have to tell you that despite the bad rap that Ukraine often gets in this area at that time, and this is 8 years ago or so, there was quite a remarkable groundswell of support within the Ukrainian military for taking action to address it, because they got the fundamental truth that corruption really hurts the military, because it means ultimately that you get less good equipment, that you pay more for things you don't really want. And the thing that any good soldier will appreciate from those kind of considerations is that ultimately it leads to more people dying. So although the results have been far from perfect, I do think there is a determination within the Ukrainian military and defense establishment to get to grips with corruption and do something about it. Because I think the message that it's in their best interest to do so has really gone home. Now, I think that's mirrored in the government. And if you look at the measures that Zelensky has taken to attack corruption in defense, particularly, but also more widely, I mean, he's sacked quite a large number of people within the defense ministry. There was that scandal involving Ukrainian officers responsible for administering national service and conscription. He has also recognized that there's a considerable popular backlash against corruption, that it's one of the things that you can least afford when you're in a kind of existential struggle like Ukraine is. And I think the Ukrainian government also understand that measures to address corruption are key, as you just said, in relationship to their aspirations for EU entry. So basically, I think the Ukrainians get it. There are always going to be hiccups along the path. It's always going to be less than perfect, and attacking corruption is a very difficult thing to do for all sorts of reasons we didn't go into here. But I think one can be comforted by the fact that Ukrainian hearts are in the right place. And while it is, of course, entirely legitimate to make a fuss about corruption, I think it's really important that on a wider scale, the rest of us shouldn't allow that to be used as camouflage for a political agenda. So it's got to be addressed, but it's in no one's interest to let that take over some of the more vital things that we have to do in respect of Ukraine.
Just moving the focus on to the Middle East, obviously that's the most current part of the world at the moment in terms of what we're seeing in the headlines every evening. But there's been so much attention on the role, or perhaps rather lack of a role, of the Gulf Arab states, particularly Saudi Arabia and the UAE, in relation to all the violence we're seeing, call it Iranian proxy violence, whether that's the Houthis' attacks in the Red Sea or Israel's response to Hamas, its ground campaign in Gaza. What do you think, to take an Emirati or a Saudi perspective, matters most in Riyadh or in Abu Dhabi in terms of political strategy and their own economic priorities?
Well, I think obviously there's going to be a difference in perspective between individual Gulf countries in respect of their economic and political priorities. I do think that over the last couple of years, we've seen attitudes in the Gulf evolving. And if you asked me to give you a single word to describe what's going on, it is more proactivity. They're much more concerned now to project their own interests, not aggressively, but more proactively. And those interests will vary from country to country. I mean, in Saudi Arabia, it's quite marked now to see the importance their 2030 and subsequent Saudi Vision 2030 agenda is having. And that's manifesting itself in a number of directions. I mean, one of which is really interesting, I think, to a business audience, is their determination to diversify out of oil and into broader economic interests that they can help safeguard, secure, and give themselves a more secure vision for their own economic development and own economic power. So it's very clear to me that the Saudis are looking for ways to diversify. I mean, they now have much more of an interest in minerals and critical minerals. They're looking overseas at where they need to get them from. And Africa, I think, for them is going to be a target of particular interest. If you look at the UAE, they too have slightly different economic interests, but they too are seeking to diversify. And you can see how their wish to project their own political influence, as with the COP conference, they want to be players on the world stage and be recognized as such. And they've also put, particular influence into their more political roles. And it's remarkable, actually, the political message the UAE is sending in terms of the medical and humanitarian assistance it's providing for Palestinians from Gaza. I mean, the country that has received the most prominence in terms of relief flights and help for Palestinians in Gaza over recent weeks has been the UAE. Also, look at Qatar. I mean, they've for a long time taken steps to pursue their own political agenda in the Gulf and more widely. And who are the two Arab countries that are underpinning the current negotiations over a ceasefire in Gaza? Qatar and Egypt. And of course, the Qatari role is partly because they allow the Hamas leadership to have a base there, so they have a stake. But I think what I'm saying is that across the Gulf and in different ways, those countries are coming out of themselves more. And that of itself is going to result in more business opportunities for the West and everyone else. There's just a need to understand what's happening and capitalize on it.
You mentioned Africa, and So just digging a little bit deeper into that. So aside from within their own country, so obviously there'll be a lot of infrastructure, a lot of construction work in Saudi. You've got this new city, Neom, for example, that is being talked about a lot. But there's so much going to go on within those countries. But looking beyond them, so you mentioned rare earths. What are some of the African countries where you're seeing activity, whether it's the Saudis or whether it's the Emiratis, where they're starting to show that proactivity?
Well, there are a number of African countries at the kind of focus of all of this. And two of the most obvious, I suppose, would be the DRC and Zambia. But it's not just them. There are a variety of countries where minerals are important. I mean, Namibia is another obvious target. Even in West Africa, places like Ghana and Niger, they're all kind of potential markets, potential mineral sources or sources of minerals. And several of those countries, particularly those in the eye of the storm, are facing a kind of deluge of outside interests in their own resources, which it pays to disentangle. I mean, Zambia's relationship with China, for example, is historic and a little bit difficult. And Chinese companies have been exploiting Zambian copper and getting involved in Zambian infrastructure for many decades now, not always successfully, it has to be said. So Africa is going to be the focus of a competition here. It's not just with the Gulf, but it's with other players as well, not least in the West, and of course Russia. So I think Africa is going to become a very interesting region over the next few years. And hopefully, I mean, a good outcome would be that many African countries are able to make the most of the wealth they have got. Whereas before, up to now, it's been hampered by a whole host of things: development, poor infrastructure, corruption you mentioned earlier. And it would be really nice if somehow over the next 5 to 10 years, Africa could navigate its way through into a web of more productive relationships with outside investors to the benefit of us all, I think.
We'll return a little bit more to Africa later. But before that, I wanted to ask you about some of the recent developments we've seen with regard to members of NATO. So we'll get to the most recent ones in Scandinavia in a second, but let's start with Turkey. It's always a complicated relationship, Turkey and the West. So where do you think Turkey is headed in geostrategic terms? It is in that geopolitical crossroads as a NATO member, but also south of Russia and between the Middle East and Europe.
Well, I think the politics of President Erdogan is a very interesting phenomenon. And I think he's been concerned for many years now to forge a role for Turkey as a key regional power that, as you've just said, has a foot in many camps. And when you dive beneath the surface of his policy, I think a lot of it is what it's all about. And you have to feed into that also the frustrations over Turkey's EU application. And Turkey is a big country. It has very significant armed forces. It's got very significant wealth. And why shouldn't it have aspirations to play the sort of regional role it wants? So I think Turkey is looking to forge a place for itself, both in the region and more widely. It also has a history of difficult relationships within NATO, particularly with Greece historically, and for obvious reasons. And the Turks are very canny negotiators. They will look to exploit issues to their own advantage. But what is very encouraging also is that ultimately, I think Turkey strongly values its membership of NATO. And when you've seen the Turkish reaction to Swedish accession has gone, for example, it's not been easy. And you can understand why, because the Kurdish issue is a very big thing for the Turkish government. We might not agree with the way in which they put it. We might not agree with their agenda, but they have an agenda and they will take it forward. And I think the way in which the discussions over Swedish accession have gone illustrate that they're perfectly sensible about knowing when to stop pushing. And it's also been interesting in the case of both Sweden and Finland that other members of the alliance, I mean, the US is the obvious example, have been prepared to help to ease the way through into accession.
Well, just join NATO as the Hungarian parliamentary vote eventually allowing that to take place. So we're now at this historic moment where essentially the Baltic has become a NATO lake with St. Petersburg very, very much isolated at the top of it. So what do you think this new Scandinavian expansion means for the alliance's centre of gravity and the dynamic of that power?
I mean, I just observe in passing that There are certain parallels between the way in which both Turkey and Hungary have behaved in relation to Swedish and Finnish accession. And again, it's noticeable that both value their membership of the alliance highly. But I think you're absolutely right to point to the fairly dramatic effect that Swedish and Finnish accession have had on the defence of NATO's northern flank. NATO now does control the Baltic. In press reports in recent days, pointing to the importance of that, and particularly now that Gotland, the Swedish island towards the southern end of the Baltic, is now under NATO control. And that has a fairly fundamental effect, as you've said, in terms of access to St. Petersburg. And one shouldn't underestimate also where it leaves Kaliningrad, the Russian enclave near Poland. So the dynamic of the defence of the northern flank has shifted quite markedly, I think. And you've now got large and well-equipped armed forces in both Finland and Sweden undertaking the process of becoming part of the NATO integrated command structure. And that's going to mean some adjustments to NATO's defence posture. They're helpful, actually, particularly helpful at a time when the threat from Russia is felt as seriously as it now is, particularly by the Baltics. And I think that's a very helpful and reassuring development from a NATO and a Western perspective. It will mean changes, it will mean adjustments. I mean, one thing about NATO is that your influence varies within the alliance according to what you put into it. So I think there's going to be a shift in power dynamics within the alliance.
Well, I was going to mention on that score as well, as well as the Scandinavians themselves, obviously Norway was already a member, but Sweden and Finland on the other side of the Baltic Three, whilst they're small countries in overall power terms, they're certainly punching above their weight in terms of what they spend on defence and also what they give to Ukraine. But the Poles particularly are spending a vast amount on defence at the moment, becoming the largest tank fleet in Europe they'll have once they arrive from their various suppliers. So it does feel like there's a northern or northeastern tilt going on.
There certainly is. And the growth in the Polish armed forces has been really dramatic. I mean, they've pretty much doubled in size. I think I don't have the figures in my head, and they're aiming to add another 100,000 soldiers and reservists over the next few years. So, I do think all this is a factor of the existential threat that countries in Europe feel is now presented by Putin's Russia. Poland has been pursuing a path of military build-up in the best sense for many years now, and that's kind of been noticeable in the way in which Polish influence in the NATO command structure has grown. So I think some of the more elder established allies may well have to take stock of their position. And it's not unnatural that in a collaborative endeavour like NATO, there'll be some shifts and realignments in terms of senior military appointments and so on. But I think one other conclusion that business in particular can draw from current developments is that the defence industry is going to be a good investment. The Finns have been particularly forward in putting their economy, it's not quite onto a war footing, it's not like what the Russians have done, and there are questions about how long that will be sustainable for Putin. But the Finns have taken steps to make sure that the arms and materiel they need will be provided in the right sort of timescale. And I think the rest of Europe is waking up to that, not least in the light of former President Trump's comments about those NATO members who won't pay their way. And there's a growing realization, I think, in Europe that they're going to have to pay their way and that mass matters. It's all very well, I think, when you're talking in terms of defense, to put a great deal of emphasis on new capabilities, cyber, asymmetric warfare, all this stuff. But one thing that Ukraine has shown is that if you get into a war these days, your tanks still matter, your infantry still matter, and your ability to put boots on the ground matters. And for that, equipment's needed.
So as you say, we're in this era now where the peace dividend after the Cold War, the kind of, frankly, 30 years of complacency after the fall of the Berlin Wall is now either over or coming to an end as politicians begin to think how they can actually broach this with their electorates. But as you alluded to already, the defence industrial complex is waking up again in Europe. So you said, essentially the defence industry is a good bet. From a business perspective, and just wanted to explore a little bit more the kind of wider consequences for not just defence industry, but the kind of wider economic construction, infrastructure, new assets that you'd expect to see, particularly in Northern Europe.
Well, I think there are two parts to this. Let's take defence first and then move into the wider field. You've got kit, ammunition, and equipment. That's one thing. We've just talked about that. But there's also a real infrastructure problem as well, because if you're going to be able to defend yourself, you have to have the infrastructure that allows you to do that. And even in Northern Europe now, in Sweden, I know there's a big debate going on about, do we have the right infrastructure necessary to be able to move things around our country fast enough? And do we have the right infrastructure in place to support a developing defence industrial base? Do we have the right infrastructure in place, and this is a UK issue, to support a developing industrial base anyway? So I think infrastructure consciousness is increasing, and it rightly should. In terms of other economic issues, well, in the UK, there's the long-running and well-known productivity problem, working practices, and all of this is bound up into a finite resource pool. And there's a big issue, I think, about how much governments in this day and age will have the capacity to do themselves, and how much industry is going to have to support its own development. And that's one of these really difficult strategic issues that all governments, I think, find it difficult to get their heads around, and industry does too. I mean, it's all part of the need for a greater strategic appreciation, a greater strategic understanding of the problems we're all facing and how we link together. On the civil side, I mean, it's really quite interesting to note that after all the Brexit-induced worry and difficulties over aviation, that Airbus have now confirmed again quite recently that their British operation is fundamental to the whole business. That they will not be attempting to scale it down. They will be taking advantage of the expertise that's available, particularly in wing development for aircraft. And I think that's a microcosm of the sort of thing that's likely to happen in the European defence area. It would be good if there could be a realization that it needs to happen across various other different sectors and across the board. But if you accept the proposition basically that mass matters, then you have to work together to produce that mass, whether it's tanks or whether it's houses or whether it's electric cars, in a way that's productive rather than divisive.
Let's return to Africa then. You already talked about it a bit earlier, and I wanted to devote some time to talking about the global south, which is a phrase that is coming up at the tail end of 2023 and 2024 much more frequently. And once upon a time, it was just the BRICS, and I think that's still useful, or at least that seems at the core of the institution itself. But in my kind of historically minded way of looking at things, I see it as a kind of a new non-aligned movement for a new Cold War. But I don't know whether that's a useful parallel. And
well, I think it partly is, but I think
I was going to say, do they have anything to unite them politically?
I think the thing that unites the global south is dissatisfaction with the way in which the old international order has treated them. And I think that's the key unifying factor. I think when you talk about the BRICS, it's a bit more problematic because you've got the big R and the big C, who are all very different. And I don't think that you would characterize either Russia or China now as part of the global south. They'd like to be associated with it in different ways and for various different reasons, but they are not part of it in the way that China 30 years ago might have argued that it was really part of the non-aligned. They've got different agendas. So I think the unifying factor across the global south, which does include the R and the C, is dissatisfaction with the old international order. How that is going to manifest itself will vary across the I and the B and the other growing major players in the south. It's a bit like what we were talking about in relation to the Gulf earlier. I think they're all going to become more assertive in their own ways. And, you know, again, you mentioned Africa, and I think that's quite a useful area to focus on because of its potential. And if Africa could get its act together, it could be quite a powerful force. But it hasn't had the capacity to do that before now, and it will be really interesting to see whether it succeeds. I mean, there are a number of initiatives going on within the AU to increase the effectiveness of its senior appointments, to put in place new trade structures and so on. And you're also seeing really quite forceful Russian and Chinese campaigns for influence in Africa.
Yeah, I mean, that's where my analogy breaks down. Clearly, if it was an aligned movement, Russia and China are not in that non-aligned thing. They are on the other side of this Cold War, but Africa certainly would be in the middle. I guess that's the core of it, is where those African countries are just anti-Western, or where they're going their own way. Historically, unfortunately, they've been shaped by history, where they can actually play a more active role in shaping.
Yeah, I think you've got a variety of views here. In French West Africa, Niger, the Central African Republic, at the moment, there's quite significant anti-French feeling. And that is driving them into the arms of people who can help them. And unfortunately, in one or two cases, it's the rebranded Wagner Group providing, as the press would have us know, regime survival packages. In other countries, though, you've got statesmen and leaders who really care about their country. And they're quite anxious to do things that will leave a lasting legacy for them. Zambia is the case in point here, I think. It's quite interesting that the Zambians have just concluded debt rescheduling agreements with both India and China. And that will then enable Zambia to go back to the IMF for further financial support. But Zambia, as I was saying earlier, is one of those countries in Africa that's at the center of the kind of interest in minerals storm. And I think the government there is going to want to do things that will really work for the good of the country, not for the good of the government. And they're two separate things here. So there are some encouraging trends emerging in Africa, some not so encouraging trends. And it will be really interesting to see what happens in relation to some of the African regional organizations as well. SADC in the south has got its eyes on a large number of planned and really rather important infrastructure projects that will stretch across its membership. But to succeed, they will have to attract support from outside investors. And here is another kind of, it not only affects government, but there's a business interest as well. You've got ECOWAS, who is one of the more effective regional organizations in Africa, but has been damaged by the anticipated withdrawal of Niger and the CAR. And they have also economic potential, but also more worrying security concerns as well. But I think there is a determination within ECOWAS to try and get to grips with the difficult politics of the region. So perhaps regional organizations in Africa are another potential key to help the continent do well.
And that's it for another episode of the Political Risk Podcast. A big thank you to Sir Stewart and the Ambassadors Partnership for agreeing to take part. I hope that you're enjoying the geopolitical risk content. I know I am. Please give the podcast a review if you can spare an extra click. Leave a comment on LinkedIn or drop me an email with any feedback or suggestions for future episodes. And there's plenty more in the pipeline, including a special episode with Mosaic Insurance on cyber risks, another episode featuring interviews that I conducted while attending the GAIF 34 Middle East Insurance Conference held recently in Muscat, Oman. I've been your host, David Benyon. My guest for this episode was Sir Stewart Eldon. Production was by Peter McGill, and my talented cousin Lawrence Durkin provided the music.